Hi there, my name is Dr. Stewart, and I'm going to provide a brief overview of kind of how food is digested in the oral cavity and the stomach. Okay, this is a brief overview. For a full explanation of how this process works, please check out my other full-length lectures. So, food, as it enters the digestive system, we're going to first enter into the mouth as we eat food. And the first job of the oral cavity is to moisten and masticate this food or chew it up through the use of our teeth and saliva. This is really important because without moistening up the food, it's going to be really hard to swallow. I mean, imagine swallowing a pack of saltine crackers or something without any saliva. So we need to moisten up that food, and we need to start the mechanical digestion by chewing it up. This is also really important because if you don't properly chew up your food, it's going to limit your body's ability to access a lot of those nutrients, okay? The saliva also contains an enzyme called salivary amylase, which begins to break down starches. So chemical digestion also starts in the oral cavity. After you've chewed up and moistened that piece of food, it now has a new name. It's called a bolus, and we need to swallow that bolus. The first stage of the swallowing process is when you press your tongue to the roof of your mouth. I can't really try to swallow without doing that. I can't do it. So the first step is you kind of press the tongue to the roof of your mouth, and your oral cavity is going to squeeze the food around each side of the tongue, where the bolus is now in the back of your throat or the pharynx. Now the pharynx is going to squeeze that bolus of food. The tongue is going to prevent it from going out the front of the mouth, right? It's going to block it there. The larynx is going to be lifted superiorly, and that's going to press against the epiglottis, which creates a barrier that prevents the food from entering into your ear canal. And then the uvula is going to swing backwards, and it's going to prevent the bolus of food from entering into the nasal cavity. So now this bolus of food is being squeezed, and it has nowhere else to go. It's going to be squeezed into the muscular tube. That's our esophagus. The upper esophageal sphincter, that's our first sphincter, is going to relax, which allows this food to enter into that esophagus. The esophagus job is to move that food from our oral cavity down to our stomach. It's going to do this through peristalsis. The muscle in the esophagus is a skeletal muscle in the upper half, and in the more inferior half is composed of smooth muscle, so it's not under our conscious control more inferiorly. It takes about 2 seconds for liquid to be swallowed and enter into the stomach or pass through the esophagus, and about 8 seconds or so for solid foods to enter into the stomach. It's then going to pass through the cardiac sphincter, which separates the stomach from the esophagus. Then it enters the stomach. Now the job of the stomach is to really break down this food and turn it into a semi-digested kind of liquid soup-like substance called chyme. It has like a yellowish green consistency, but ultimately the job of the stomach is to digest food, this solid food, and turn it into chyme. Very little, if at all, absorption occurs inside the stomach. Okay, so the stomach is like doing this job of turning the food into chyme through 2 different processes. First, it really uses the strong, smooth muscles of the muscularis layer to help grind and mix up that food. Second of all, it's secreting a bunch of acid, hydrochloric acid, which digests everything. In addition, it's strong enzymes like pepsin, which help to specifically digest proteins. And those 2 processes of mixing up the food and grinding it muscularly, and also through hydrochloric acid, turn this solid food into this green chyme. Once it's turned into chyme, it's now time for that chyme to move into the small intestine. The first part of the small intestine is the duodenum, and it is squirted slowly into the duodenum with each stomach contraction. Let's move over here, though, and let's look at the wall of the stomach in a little bit more detail. The inside of the stomach is lined with these little holes. They're like these dead-ended holes called gastric pits. And these pits are essential at producing the hydrochloric acid and the pepsin that's used to digest the food. Well, the inside of the stomach is going to be lined with simple columnar epithelium. The lining of the stomach itself and the entrance of these gastric pits are composed of these green cells called mucosal cells. They produce mucus that protect the stomach from its own acidic juices. So if it wasn't for this mucus, the stomach would digest itself, and that would be a problem. In fact, if some of this acidic contents of the stomach leak into the esophagus because the cardiac sphincter isn't completely closed, that's going to lead to acid reflux or heartburn because the esophagus does not contain this protective mucus, and it is irritated by the acidic liquid. Inside the gastric pits, it's going to be lined with several types of columnar epithelial cells. First, you'll have these blue parietal cells right here. These guys produce hydrochloric acid, which are secreted into the gastric pits and emerge into the stomach. They digest everything. The pink chief cells, they produce an inactive enzyme called pepsinogen. Now, when pepsinogen mixes with hydrochloric acid, it forms a very powerful enzyme called pepsin, which we use to digest proteins. Finally, you're going to have some gastroendocrine cells, which release hormones into the blood, which helps to control the digestive process. So that's a very quick overview of the oral cavity and stomach. Next little mini lecture, we'll talk about the roles of the small intestine and the large intestine. Thank you.